After a difficult battle in Cornwall along the River Camel, King Arthur had been gravely wounded and was forced to retreat to Avalon. He left the crown to the young Cornish noble Constantine, who would become the next king of the Britons. Constantine would inherit the realm in a state of chaos. The Saxons, brought over by the traitor Mordred, immediately revolted against him, under the leadership of Mordred's two sons. Constantine engaged the Saxons in a series of battles with great success. During this time, however, many components of the empire which Arthur had built broke away and returned to being independent. Eventually, Constantine was victorious, and the two sons of Mordred fled, one to a church in Winchester, and another to a church in London. Not concerned for holy things, though, Constantine slew both brothers in their respective churches, right before the altars. Then, in the third year of Constantine's reign, he himself was murdered, and the people considered it God's judgment for the sins he had committed. Now, after the death of Constantine, we get a chain of kings who don't really matter too much, the first of which was Constantine's nephew, Aurelius Conon. We don't really know much about him, other than that he had an uncle who he fought against to claim the throne. Later on, he would die, and be succeeded by Vortigern. King Vortigern managed to defeat a Saxon invasion at the start of his reign. He then ruled for 4 years in peace before also dying. He was followed by King Maelgo. Maelgo was a warlike king, and he fought many battles, restoring some of the empire which Arthur had built. He died after this, though, and the territories he conquered were abandoned almost immediately. The throne was left to a man known as Caratacus. Now, in Ireland, weakened from King Maelgo's conquest, they were once more invaded, not by Britons this time, but by a Germanic tribe from the south, known as the Vandals. They were led by a man known as King Gormond, and he tore through Ireland, sacking many towns and cities. Meanwhile, back in Britain, another Saxon invasion fleet was sighted along the coastline. However, instead of attacking directly, this time the Saxons sailed round to Ireland, where they forged an alliance with King Gormond. From there, they agreed to invade Britain together. Gormond crossed into Britain and fought a series of battles against King Caratacus, and was victorious. Caratacus was forced to retreat to Cirencester. There he was besieged for several months, until at last Gormond took that city as well. Cirencester was burned to the ground, whilst Caratacus fled to Wales. There he then mysteriously disappeared, leaving most of the kingdom undefended, whilst Gormond went on to sack and burn many more cities. There was chaos across the land. Many towns, cities, and churches were burned and destroyed by the invaders. Thousands more Saxons poured into the kingdom, and the Britons who were in their path were forced to flee westward. They retreated into the lands of Wales and Cornwall, which were the only parts of the kingdom to resist the invasion. Many Britons also fled south, across the sea, where they would settle in Brittany. Unlike previous invasions of Britain, this conquest by the Saxons would be permanent, with the Britons losing their authority over the lands in the east forever. The Saxons would divide up the lands between them and establish several smaller kingdoms for themselves. During this time, the Pope in Rome sent a monk called Augustine to the Saxons in order to try and convert them to Christianity. He had some initial success converting the people of Kent. However, whilst Augustine was in Britain, he came into contact with the Christian Britons and realised that the churches here had been acting independently of Rome for many years. Augustine demanded that they submit to Rome and then assist him in converting the Saxons. However, the Britons refused. Therefore, Ethelbert, King of Kent, decided to bring the Britons to justice for defying Augustine. He allied with Ethelfred, King of Northumbria, and they each raised an army of Saxons ready to face the Britons. Knowing the Saxons would soon be invading, a Briton earl known as Brockmel gathered his own small army and marched to Leicester. He also brought with him a large number of monks, with which he asked to pray for the safety of the Britons. When the Saxons arrived in the city, they did battle against the Britons and were victorious. The Saxons went on to slaughter the monks who were sheltering in the city. This act drew great outrage from the Britons of Wales and Cornwall, and the various dukes allied together to bring the Saxons to justice. Forming a large army, they gathered their forces together and marched on Leicester. A huge battle took place, with vast losses on both sides, but eventually the Britons were victorious, and the Saxons fled the field. In the aftermath, the dukes and princes of the Britons came together in Leicester, and voted to make a duke known as Cadvan their king. Cadvan had previously ruled in North Wales, and he had shown great valour in the battle. With this settled, the Britons set their ambitions towards reclaiming their ancestral lands. To this end, they marched north to Northumbria. King Ethelfred gathered support from the other Saxon kings and travelled to meet them with an army. Both armies lined up for battle, but then they opted to negotiate instead, neither side apparently having the stomach for further bloodshed at the current time. Eventually, it was agreed that the Britons would hold on to the lands they had recently reclaimed, and the new borders were put in place. Now, in the years that followed, Cadvan had 2 sons, Cadwallo and Edwin. The boys were sent to Brittany, where they would be raised in the court of King Solomon so that they could be trained in the ways of knighthood. That they did, and when they were older, they became known as skilled warriors. When Cadvan grew old and died, the boys returned to Britain to rule. When they were in Britain, Edwin went to his older brother, Cadwallo, and asked that the realm be split in 2 so they could each be king of half of it. Cadwallo agreed to ponder the matter. Then, one day, whilst resting by a river bank, he considered the long history of conflict between the Saxons and the Britons, and how they had first arrived here back in the reign of Vortigern, and now the Saxons controlled most of the country. Therefore, Cadwallo decided to take it upon himself to remove the Saxon problem once and for all. But if he was to do that, he would need all of the resources of the realm behind him, and so he could not go forward with Edwin's request to split the kingdom in half. Cadwallo went to Edwin and informed him of this. Edwin was furious at the news and left, heading north, where he stayed at the court of the Northumbrian king, and he declared that one day he would wear the crown of the Britons. Cadwallo understood this as an act of war, and soon the armies of Britons and Northumbrians were skirmishing against each other along the border. Then a major battle took place, which decisively went in Edwin's favour. Through some skilled manoeuvring, Edwin prevented Cadwallo from retreating further into the Briton heartlands, and instead forced him west towards the sea. Cadwallo retreated all the way to the coastline, where he was forced to board a ship to escape and travelled to Ireland. With him gone, Edwin marched his Saxon army into the lands of the Britons, sacking towns as he went. In Ireland, Cadwallo tried to organise the remnants of his forces and return to Britain. He prepared to set sail. Meanwhile, though, out of Spain came a rather unusual wizard named Pelitus, who joined Edwin at his court. Pelitus used his powers to prophesy where Cadwallo planned to make landing, and so, when Cadwallo sailed to Britain, he found that Edwin would move to intercept him at his landing point and force the Britons back into the sea. This happened several times. Feeling a sense of despair from this, Cadwallo changed his plan and sailed south, hoping to get support from King Solomon in Brittany. However, on his way, his fleet was hit by a great storm and was scattered in all directions. Cadwallo's own ship was wrecked upon the coast of Guernsey, losing many of the crew along the way. There they stayed for several days whilst they made repairs to the ship, and then, finally, with good winds, they travelled onwards to Brittany, where he met with King Solomon. King Solomon of Brittany was dismayed to hear of the state of Britain, and he criticised Cadwallo and his predecessors for allowing the nation to fall into such a state. Yet he recalled the shared ancestry that the two peoples had, and in the end declared that he would support Cadwallo in reclaiming his lands. Cadwallo would spend the winter in Brittany, and whilst there, he felt the need to deal with that wizard that Edwin had recruited, before any invasion took place. To this end, he sent one of his companions, who had been with him in Guernsey, a man known as Briton, to Britain to deal with the wizard. Briton made land in the south and travelled up to York, disguised as a poor man. With him, he took a shaft of iron with a sharpened point, which he pretended to be a walking stick. Once in York, he joined with a company of poor men who were waiting to receive alms before the king's door. Whilst waiting there, to his shock, he saw his own sister walking past. He went to speak with her, and they were both very happy to be reunited. It turned out that she had been carried off by Edwin when he had sacked Worcester, and since then she had been made to serve in the king's court. Brian's sister explained the layout of the palace and when would be the best time to assassinate Pelitus. A few days later, Brian was once again amongst the poor men, and this day it was the wizard Pelitus' turn to be distributing the alms. Brian moved in close, and with a thrust of his staff into the man's chest, he killed him. In a subsequent chaos, he abandoned the staff and slipped away into the crowds of the city. He then travelled south to Exeter, where he sent messengers on to Brittany, the reporting of the wizard's death. The Saxons soon figured out what had happened and allied together to get revenge upon the Britons. Led by King Piander of the Mercians, they marched an army to Exeter and laid siege to the city. Meanwhile, Cadwallo arrived in Britain with an army of 10,000 men which King Solomon had placed under his command. He headed straight for Exeter, engaged the Saxons in battle, and won swiftly. In his victory, he routed the Saxons and captured King Piander. After this, Cadwallo wasted no time, marching north all the way to Northumbria, where he fought a battle against his brother Edwin. Again, he was victorious, and Edwin was slain during the battle. With the Saxons defeated in 2 major battles, Cadwallo marched across their petty kingdoms virtually unopposed. He set about making each of the Saxon kings submit to him. Before long, he had made them each his vassal, and had restored Briton rule to the whole kingdom. He then celebrated Pentecost in London, before returning west to his strongholds in Wales to rule at peace for a while. Whilst there, Margadad, Duke of South Wales, urged Cadwallo to drive out the Saxons entirely. He reminded him of their history, where the Saxons had betrayed the Britons multiple times. Cadwallo was hesitant, so Margadad suggested that they at least exploit the rivalries of the different Saxon kingdoms. Now at this moment, King Piander of Mercia wished to wage war upon Oswy, the new king of Northumbria, and heeding Margadad's request, Cadwallo gave the king leave to do so. Piander gathered an army and invaded, but ended up being defeated and slain in battle. His son, Wilfred, would inherit the throne of Mercia, and intended to get revenge for his father. However, Cadwallo changed his mind by this point, and ordered the Saxons to stop their war. Not long after this, Cadwallo caught a bad illness, and he would die a few months later. He was succeeded by his son, Cadwaladr. Cadwaladr ruled at peace for 12 years, but then he too began to fall ill. Whilst he was sick, he lacked the ability to govern Britain, and the dukes of the realm were left to govern themselves. Soon, discord stirred between them, and the dukes fought each other to resolve their disputes, plunging the realm into chaos. This situation was worsened by a famine which struck the whole isle. With all this happening, the Saxons in Britain reasserted themselves as the dominant power on the isle. Once he recovered somewhat from his illness, Cadwaladr joined a large number of Britons and travelled to Brittany in search of food. There he joined King Alan, the nephew of the late King Solomon, at his court. Once the famine was over, Cadwaladr, like his father, went to the king of the Britons and asked for military support to reclaim the territory in Britain. However, at that moment, it is said that Cadwaladr heard a voice in his head of an angel telling him not to return to Britain, but instead to journey to Rome to live as a holy man instead. The angel also told him that the Britons would no longer be the dominant power in Britain, and instead they would be reduced to just the lands of Wales and Cornwall. However, if Cadwaladr did what God commanded and lived a saintly life in Rome, then one day the Britons would be restored to their former glory. Upon hearing the voice, he passed on what he had heard to King Alan, and he forsook the crown and set off to Rome. He left his son Ivor and his nephew Inni in charge of the remaining Britons. Cadwaladr eventually arrived in Rome, where he met with the Pope. A few months later, he fell ill once more and died. Now, back north, Ivor and Inni gathered their ships and returned to Britain. There, they would launch several raids upon the Saxons, but failed to reclaim any substantial territory. Now, as time went on, the ancient customs of the Britons would begin to fade, and they would become known to outsiders, not as Britons, but as Welsh. The Saxons, on the other hand, would develop their newly conquered lands, building new castles and cities. The lands they would rule would eventually, collectively, become known as England. The Welsh would live confined to their own lands. However, they would never give up hope that one day they would be restored to their former glory.